Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Glad to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. How are we this fine morning?
I feel pretty
late
good.
Morning?
Yeah, Thanksgiving's coming, one of my favorite holidays. It's a nice time of year. It's not fall-ish, but it's cloudy.
Yeah,
Cloudy if too warm.
People are freaking out about the rain a little bit.
I just like a change. I mean, it's just so dang hot and sunny here all the time.
The 85 in November last week, or last week, I guess, over the weekend was not
kind of lame.
Not great. So the big news as we get together today, still, it's now a couple days old as we meet on Thursday morning, is the federal court ruling invalidating the congressional maps passed by the legislature. Now, there are other big stories out there, and we'll kind of wind up backing into one or two of them, I think. But in a 2-1 vote, a 3-judge panel ruled that Texas must set aside the new congressional maps that it drew earlier this year, with the majority writing that the map, which would create 5, theoretically was,
right. Designed and intended.
Sort of designed and intended to create up to 5 new GOP-friendly House seats, was an unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. And if you look at the decision, the opinion in this, it was, that's more specific than you might think. Right, in terms of it being a racial gerrymandering, being a kind of legal classification and characterization of the maps. The ruling is very pointed. And look, for those of you who, may not routinely read these but are followers of Texas politics, it's, there's a lot of like, oh, I know that guy. As they're going through and trying to unpack the rationalizations and the public statements for the maps, a lot of, known players in the process that, it's not trying to be coy about this. A lot of discussion of very, specific justifications and some fact checks in some cases about what intent was, who knew what when, who had meetings with whom and under what circumstances, involving, a lot of people and some pretty close parsing of the governor's statements as to the intent and rationale for the gerrymander look, nobody disputes it's
that's true, right? That's fair.
So that's not unfair.
Right.
I would say very worth looking at. If you follow this, and again, and it's pretty salty, and there was. The ruling is written by District Judge Jeffrey Brown and also signed on to by Judge David Wadarama. Brown has gotten a lot of attention. Trump appointee, Wadarama is a Obama appointee, but Judge Jeffrey Brown has been around in Texas politics for a while. I mean,
right. Appointed
as a district judge, then later an appellate judge, and then elevated to the state Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Initial appointments were by Governor Perry, and then nominated by Donald Trump, presumably with input from Texas,
right,
for the federal court.
Right. So you can't just, dismiss the ruling as from some partisan appointee of the other side, all that
right.
kind of, it's not that easy to dismiss. I mean, not that people aren't trying.
Which is a good setup for the scathing dissent that was issued by Reagan appointee Jerry Smith. He's been on the court for a very long time, obviously. Been a federal judge for a long time, and he was the appellate judge on the panel, I believe. And the scathing, we'll talk about the scathing language on both sides, I suppose, to be fair. I mean, the choice language to characterize the and it's been widely quoted in coverage. You don't have to read the decision to see this. That was used by Judge Brown to characterize the Justice Department memo that was at least initially used in the, specifically in the first call for a special session, which was the motivation for this, as, basically factually inaccurate, misinterpreted, the key case that it was supposed to be characterizing. And he, also said, typographically lacking. So, it's pretty rough. I mean, and, there's a lot of, thumping that goes on here. And then, for his part, Judge Smith in the dissent, raises, Jerry Brown and Soros and all, so it's a very interesting decision
you've read a little
and
bit,
dissent.
You've read a little bit more than I have, so I don't want to put you on the spot here. But I mean, my impression, at least from the coverage, was that a lot of the dissent's thrust was more so about, the notion of like this is an activist decision. And so I mean, is it about like whether the court has the authority to even be sort of?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there was, and I've not read through the whole thing, but I mean, there were a couple of things that were going on. There was some of that. There was, a lot of. I mean, there was a level of it was just that this was too political.
Right.
This was politically motivated.
I want to raise an important set piece to understand that in general, as we understand it, when a quote unquote political question is coming up, of which, the drawing of maps can be and can edge into this other area of, rights and liberties and all that kind of stuff. But in general, we kind of tend to believe that the courts, for the most part, don't want to insert themselves or try not to insert themselves into overtly political questions or fights.
Yeah, I mean, with redistricting, though,
it's kind of impossible here, but that's why I thought the argument was a little interesting to sort of,
Well, I mean, if you look, I think if you look at the decision, I mean, if you look at that dissent, I mean, it's even less like the court shouldn't be engaging in a political argument. It was much more personal and direct.
Yeah.
In saying that, the judge was basically almost quasi literally says siding with George Soros and Gavin Newsom and the overall political fight. I mean, it's very direct. So
it's interesting.
It's pretty interesting. And then also a process piece in which, clearly, and by clearly I mean explicitly, Judge Smith was angry that he accuses the two other judges of not giving him sufficient time to compose his dissent, and the dissent did come out kind of late, right?
Yeah.
So, or at a interval after the release of the actual opinion. So there's a lot going on here, right? We just said there's a lot going on here.
Really fascinating.
Personally and politically here between, on this panel.
Yeah.
Which is, sort of a whole other thing unto itself. But, basic point, if you follow the legislature closely, and if you've been following this process, it's worth digging into, the kind of middle part of the ruling, because there's just a lot of blow by blow, and then, and I didn't want to be coy earlier. I mean, there's a lot of, detailed discussion of comments and justifications and accounts and some of the testimony given during the hearings by, Chairman Hunter, Chairman King, David Spiller, and then, of course, a pretty close parsing of the governor's statements. So, I would look for that. Now, Attorney General Ken Paxton, not surprisingly, quickly announced his intent to file an appeal with the Supreme Court of the United States and to ask for a stay of the order, I think pending it being overturned, pending a full hearing. And you and I were talking about this before. I don't want to get out of my lane.
Yeah.
I've talked to some other people that are constitutional scholars, that do research at least adjacent to this, and kind of weren't entirely sure what the court's options were given the nature of this panel. If you know this, I mean, I'm, kind of waiting to see, what other people that really live in this stuff say about it. And a lot of my usual sources have not posted yet. By my usual sources, I mean Steve Vladeck,
right?
Who I'm like, I don't know if you're out. Steve probably doesn't listen to this, but if you know Steve Vladeck, tell him, we're kind of waiting on a post from his Substack to
explain,
see what his view of this is, because he's had a pretty good track record on court watching and does a good job of explaining these things, and is also good at saying, I thought this was going to happen. I was right about this. I was wrong about this, which we could all use more of. So for the moment, I mean, we're in an interesting political moment on this, though, as we wait to see what and when and how the court is going to rule, But for the moment, the maps passed at the Trump administration's direction this summer are out. Right. Previous maps are nominally in effect, with speculation now turning, of course, to what the court's going to do. And so we're seeing a lot of gestures already, certainly among Democrats,
right,
that are a mixture of self-interest and also clearly an effort to sort of present the current situation as the situation. And what I mean by that is, Lloyd Doggett has said he'll
back and running.
I'll get back in, and I believe Greg Casar has now said he'll go back to running to the other, the original in his district.
Houston's going to be a whole thrown up into a mess.
A lot of signals coming out of Houston. What's going on there? And I'm sure I'm probably missed things in some of the other races. So the politics are very much active right now with the durability of the status quo very much in question. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday and I was reading these court decisions, and the first thing reasonably watchful and knowledgeable person said was, well, Supreme Court's just going to overturn it, right?
Well, I mean, not exactly, but yeah, I mean, I think that's the real question right now. I mean, there's sort of two, what I said to someone else is there's sort of two dates that we're kind of watching for, one that we know about and one that we don't.
Yeah.
Right. The one that we know about is the candidate filing deadline. And for the most part, if you're one of those Democrats, it behooves all the Democrats who want to try to create the current 2021 map as the status quo to file under those districts, to put their names in there, and to do all the legal requirements necessary to say these are the districts we're running in.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that does, I'm going to say the Supreme Court's going to do whatever the Supreme Court wants to do, but it does put some pressure on the backside to say, ultimately the filing deadline is a little bit of a, I don't want to say it's a drop dead date because things can be moved, things can be adjusted, but in general, the courts aren't going to want to interfere once candidates have filed and they're running, and
the other issue floating around here that I do want to talk to some con law people about is the degree to which the Attorney General Paxton's request for a stay becomes kind of a shadow docket matter because of the urgency of all those issues and the timing of that.
And that's the other date that we don't know.
Exactly.
So we know that, and the other date is how long it takes the court to respond. I think Quorum Report was quick to point out that they've responded as quickly as 11 days to these kinds of matters in the past for Texas.
Yeah, I think Scott Braddock had a post on that pretty quickly. And and then the other thing, this goes back to something that we raised as kind of a, just a thing to keep in mind over the last few months, after the passage of these maps, is that depending on what this all looks like, if the Supreme Court does anything other than a very clear thumbs up or thumbs down, say they remand it back to the federal court, and remember, this hearing came out of the federal court hearing on the 2021 maps.
Right.
This has been spun out of that, as I recall. And so if it's remanded back to that court, then we're back into considering the possibility of the 2012 scenario where maybe the primary date moves.
Yeah, which is totally possible. I think,
which is kind of the upshot of what you were, I think, kind of getting at earlier in terms of the deadlines and dates.
No, that's right. And I think, it's one of those really interesting areas where, in addition to sort of the arcane, realities of law and procedure and all that kind of stuff that we're less expert in. One of the things that I think we're more expert in, but that we're unfortunately forced to be honest about is we really don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. I mean, just to put it out there. And that's the key here is, the deadline's important because then, we have a constellation of candidates who think they're running in a district. We have voters who technically they could already be communicating with, and that, creates pressure. But at the same time, there's nothing that stops the Supreme Court and, honestly, all these courts from moving these elections to accommodate
and it doesn't have to be a federal court can do it as a consequence of
and so
what's floating around out there.
And I think there's another piece of this too, which is before the Democrats get too on their high horse about this. I mean, ultimately, what they're arguing about is two maps that they're both contesting. They're contesting both of those sets of maps. So it's not like they can say no, they have to be the 2021 maps and not the 2025 maps because they're less racist.
Yeah.
It's a tough one,
Well, look, we're not here to talk about the decision, and I don't know how much of it you've read, but I mean, one of the fascinating things about the decision is the way that I'm going to use this word anyway because interpret isn't quite strong enough, is the way that it really interpolates this new conception of what's allowable in the use of race and what's not.
Yeah.
And there's a technical issue of whether Pettaway, the decision in Pettaway, how far it actually limited the use of coalition districts. And the judge hinges a lot on that, because one of the hinges of this decision is he said the Justice Department memo misunderstood and mischaracterized Petaway, and then that mistake was replicated in the way that all the Texas political leaders rationalized and executed the maps.
Right.
And that was actually about, and so what we're in there saying, yeah, the Republicans should not have drawn these maps because they were too racially conscious in their effort to use this flawed interpretation of Petaway as banning coalition districts or having anything to do with it. I mean, legal experts, lawyers out there, I know that I'm fuzzing that up a little bit, but I think that's basically correct.
Yeah.
And so, really the big thing is you guys inappropriately used a racial rationale.
Yeah.
And that's pretty wild in a certain, if you step back, I mean, it makes sense when you're in the logic of it. But in the historical arc of these things, it's like, oh.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think you need to be a legal expert here just to sort of step back and look at sort of the politics of it. And if you've watched enough sort of redistricting exercises over the years, know that there's two things. One, every other redistricting effort we've seen is notable for how little is said, right? Especially by the people creating the maps in terms of how they're thinking. I mean, the sort of the watchword, as I recall from every other redistricting hearing we have ever seen, is race and ethnicity was not considered in the construction of these maps. And that is repeated over and over and over again. And they learned after, the 2000, redistricting fiasco about what they're going to communicate in emails and what they're going to say publicly. Yeah. And what's been so notable about these processes is just, again, how careful they are, knowing that regardless of what happens, they're putting down a record that's going to go into a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And this was both marked by, one, a total jettisoning of that, sort of general care, to your point about how you can go blow by blow through the statements that people were making. But then also the other part of it was sort of, I think what you're pointing out was just, again, without a legal, sort of getting a little bit over the skis here. Like, this decision was made, what its implications are, how far it goes, and what it fully means is still going to be litigated. And that's part of the open question here. But to assume that, like, even if it's, misinterpreted or whatever, that essentially, we have a new world, we can do this a different way, we can be open about how we're doing it, it's fine, was a pretty big leap of faith. I think even while it was happening.
Well, what the judge thinks is that it wasn't faith.
Yeah, well, that's
it was just a mistake, right? It was just wrong. And then, and look, I mean, I think this was noticeable during the discussion, and we'll move on. But as we saw the rationale for the maps move on, and then it was pointed out that DOJ memo may have been mistaken. That was happening in real time, and you did see you saw a shift from, we're doing this, and the cover is DOJ has told us that the coalition districts are inadmissible use of race, can't do it.
Right.
To once they realized that was shaky, you did get this more blanket, which I think really fits what you're saying, this kind of blanket assumption that as long as we just say that now we're doing it for partisan reasons, and that's totally allowable, that we're going to be fine.
Right. Even though we're dismantling districts based on race, because that's what the rationale we're
based
using.
on, and then they sort of acted, again, there was an active effort to not, later on, after the Democrats left and came back, I mean, the tone of the debates and even the tone of the language, which we noted at the time, I think even on the podcast, even the rationale that was used in the language of the second special session call compared to the first special session call, Governor Abbott omitted reference to the to the DOJ memo in the second call, and that was widely noticed at the time.
Yeah, and I think, and Abbott, I would say Abbott distanced himself from that DOJ letter almost as quickly as he sort of swept it up.
But this is why, like, reading the decision is really pretty great, or super interesting, because the judge addresses that very directly. And kind of turns that, kind of uses that as evidence that in the first instance, this was instigated by that. They may have, shifted gears later, but his argument, and this is one of the things, one could argue this different ways.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think will be reviewed is whether his argument that, they started the process based on this, and whatever they said later, if we're looking at what the rationale was and what triggered this process, it was this flawed understanding and this inadmissible deployment of race.
Yeah.
So we shall see. Now, the political kind of piece of this, that has really been a part of the political reading of this in the kind of inside politics world of, the Politico and all this kind of, Politico world, shall we call it, is that this does throw kind of a wrench into the overall redistricting plan. And, people, it's hard to miss the irony that Texas aggressiveness on this really triggered this. The California thing is now passed, and now the Texas thing has been undone.
Right.
Potentially.
Right.
At least for the moment. It's been undone or at least called into question. And, in that sense, if you're just looking at the horse race aspect of this, it's potentially an unfortunate setback for what, you were speculating this from the beginning, may have been a very strong, a considerable overestimation of what Republicans could get out of this and gaining House seats to begin with.
Yeah.
But even worse now, and the whole thing is kind of metastasized in some ways, but the original sort of instigation is now being called into question. So there is the question of what is the implication, that this, not even what. We know that this is going to have implications for one way or whatever way for the effort of Republicans to hang on to the House and what the playing field of the 2026 midterms look like in terms of Congress.
It does make you wonder. I mean, I'm just wondering right now, I'll just throw this out there, actually. I was sort of thinking to myself, about criticisms of the court recently in the shadow docket, and I think there's a lot of expectations on the left in particular that, the court is going to basically, rubber stamp the status quo of the 2025 map and kind of just sort of say,
the person who said to me, they're just going to overturn it was somebody to the left of center.
That describes the person.
Yes.
Right. And now I think if anything, if you've been watching politics over the last, year and a half, you'd say, that seems like a pretty
odds on bet.
Odds on bet. The question, I guess, would be, given the broader environment that we're talking about here, polling data that is increasingly unfavorable to the president, both in general, but I mean, in particular, when we're talking about Texas and these congressional districts, among key groups that they would expect and need to be effective with in terms of, just, I want to say the way they draw these districts to guarantee a victory, but certainly to guarantee a comfortable victory.
Yeah, sure.
In those districts, right? And so you sort of wonder at this point, you have the Supreme Court hands down, a decision that kind of puts these maps in where, a Trump-appointed judge has this decision out basically just blasting the crap out of these maps for all these reasons. Does that really
No, well, it's funny you would say that because, on the other side of that, Rick Hasen did a quick post after the dissent came out and saying that the nature of the dissent, because it was so personal,
that's what I was going to say to you. It's problematic.
May have hurt the chances that the Supreme Court, the majority on the Supreme Court's impulse to just
I was going to say that
to restore the maps was probably hurt.
I was going to say that to you because, I mean, and that's right, and I want to be fair because that's where the timing thing actually matters.
Yeah.
Like, if he had more time to write the dissent, maybe it would be a more, let's just say, legally based and less personal dissent.
He says that explicitly to begin. He's like, hey, look, this is a little scattershot.
Yeah.
It doesn't say, because these assholes didn't, give me enough time. It's sorry. It's a little disorganized. But it's very explicit.
But that's the thing, though. But for those, again, the dissent is where, in some ways, the arguments against the ruling are supposed to be drawn from.
Right.
And so the fact that he didn't have time or they didn't get in there, wherever those arguments are, it is a problem potentially. But again.
And what it does is it gives, it could potentially give the Supreme Court, a way of slowing this all down or, rolling it back to some unknown point that is a little more procedural than substantive.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one other thing that, it's like, oh, look, while we don't approve of his tone, we take, the judge's, complaints and think it did flaw the process and ergo.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it would be.
We want to remand it in some way.
Again, if you've been watching redistricting fights, court cases around voting laws, all that kind of stuff for some number of years, the number of times that the decision ultimately is like that, it just turns it back to some procedural point in time based on some, potential flaw in some part of the process. Everybody who's waiting for something goes, oh, wait, what does that mean?
Yeah, no, look, courts have, going back to some degree to your political decision argument, which I'm not sure fits exactly just what he was doing, but more broadly, the courts, judges, but Supreme Court, they find interesting and creative ways to avoid things that they're trying to avoid.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, they've in some ways, the courts have more ability to do that than most actors in the political process.
Right. So so all of this, and particularly the piece about how this, one more wrinkle in thinking about the elections next year, which you've been talking a bit the last few podcasts. It does fold into this bigger topic of what's going on nationally in terms of the state of the balance of power between the parties, what the terrain of the election is going to look like, and Donald Trump's position and his political capital in this moment.
Yeah.
I think there have been a lot of things in the last couple weeks. Some of this has been conversations I've had with people, but it's also been edging in. I was going to go to my inbox and take a screenshot. I mean, the last week I could just go to the subject line in my Gmail and see a lot of, is MAGA cracking up?
Right.
Is tension in the coalition, has Trump lost the support of MAGA? A lot of that is just driven by the Epstein case.
Right. Fishers.
But we had talked about wanting to kind of unpack this and kind of assess this. I mean, we can start in any number of places, and we've gathered some data.
I don't even know if we need that much of this data, really.
I don't think so, actually. But it's kind of
we can
useful
talk
to have
about generally.
some of it. But we can just keep going on this. And time-wise, we probably spent more time on the first part than we would have anyway. But I think there is. Yeah, what we prepared and the kind of usual stuff we do.
Yeah. Let me make a broad.
Where's the partisan structure on redistricting as a topic as this works its way through the system? And one thing we do know is that not a ton of people compared to other issues reported having heard a lot about this. I mean, nobody, but.
Yeah, it's sort of in the middle of the pack. It's not a high salience issue, but I think one of the things
we're probably talking, in other words, we went back and looked at the news battery responses from our last poll in October, where we give people, we've talked about this on here. We use this data. We give people a list of things that have been in the news and
political stories,
seemingly people following politics have paying attention to, and just ask people how much they've heard about it.
Yeah, and then you find out that normal people have heard a lot less than you have.
Right.
But basically the gist is it's not, a super high salience issue. And I think part of it reflects the fact that, in Texas, nobody was asking for this. This wasn't something that was on the radar of the public. This was something that was thrust, sort of into the process very directly and very noisily. And so what you find is, not surprisingly, more attention to this among Democrats, obviously, than among, independents and Republicans. Overall, we saw plurality opposition to efforts to redraw the district lines back in August. When we asked about it, 41% were opposed, 34% approved. Not surprisingly, 25% no idea, because this has just sort of kind of came out of nowhere. And also redistricting is generally a little bit esoteric for normal people, who don't follow this stuff. Overall, we look at the partisan distribution, it's one of those intensity things again. 78% of Democrats disapproved of efforts to redraw the line, 72% strongly disapproved. 65% of Republicans approved, so almost 2/3, but only 45% would say they approved strongly. So again, less of an intense issue because it wasn't something, again, that people were talking about, asking for. This is a very strategic political effort.
And look, the Democrats got one thing they wanted.
Yeah.
At least from the quorum break, which is it did raise the salience of it.
Well, and I'll say
put it in a national context.
They got two things. You know why? Because honestly, we're close to the filing deadline, and push this court case closer to the filing deadline, which does create extra pressure on the process. So they did get two things out of it. And then I'd say one other piece of this is Donald Trump's efforts to redraw Texas's congressional districts. 48% of Texans disapproved of that. 35% approved. This was in August. 91% of Democrats disapproved. 57% of independents. But, and this will kind of probably take us into the B block a little bit of this.
Yeah, right.
But 70% of Republicans approved of this effort, 48% strongly. So not a majority, but it's not as though this is against public opinion within the base of the party.
Right, that's exactly right. That's why we had this. That's a good thing to set up. So
okay.
So over the last couple of weeks, like I've said, we've talked about this question of and it's obviously an important question because Trump has been such a galvanizing force among Republicans in any number of ways. Public opinion, elite opinion, institutional behavior. We've talked about all those things a lot. and over the last couple of weeks in the podcast, and we've looked at, this question of the slight erosion of Trump's position in Texas, and probably more than slight nationally, I think, which we should expect.
Yeah, I think that's right. Based on partisan distribution.
Yeah, and, you and I were talking, there was, some very recent national polling. I think both NPR, Marist, and Fox released new national polling yesterday, all of which showed Donald Trump's job approval continuing to be pretty unimpressive, right?
Yeah, and I think moving in really a pretty negative trend. I mean, if you kind of divide the data up, we're looking at sort of the Real Clear Politics averages, and also just looking at the polls that have come out. And even if you look at the polls sort of from earlier in November versus later in November, you can see that earlier in November, for the most part, we're talking about the spread here. So the share who approve minus the share who disapprove, and in general, his net approval rating has been ranged between around, I would say, mid-negative teens, -13, -17, -14. When we look at sort of the more recent Fox News poll, -17. So the average that we see over the month is about -12 on the spread, but actually the more recent polling, it looks a little bit, all the recent polls are higher than that, just to say it out loud. That's a good way to kind of think about the trend of it. And that's, similar to what we've seen in Texas to some degree, right? I mean, when he started out, his overall job approval in Texas at the beginning of the year was 52 approve, 38 disapprove. Today it's 51 disapprove, 42 approve. So his approval has gone down 10 points. His disapproval has gone up 13 points. Again, among Republicans, largely unchanged. I mean, his approval has gone down 8 points. But again, that's from right after his election. It's easy to make too much of that. But among independents, his disapproval has gone up 12 and is sitting at about 60% for the last 3 polls. His approval has gone down by 8 points since the start. And so we're seeing this just all over the place. And so, Texas is a little bit less pronounced than it is nationally because of the distribution of the state. We've got more Republicans here than other people. The real challenge, outside of, just sort of...
And a lot of very conservative.
And a lot of very conservative independents.
This gets to the point, conservative / MAGA / what...
Right. We got plenty of everybody, in some ways. But yes, we have more of that. We also have conservative-leaning independents here, probably, for the most part.
Yes, which makes that independent number kind of interesting.
Well, and this is what I think points to the real challenge here, and this is the challenge that the president's team is very aware of, Republicans are very aware of, and it's the economy, right? And it's this issue of, the president had a hard time saying it, but this issue of affordability, right? And when you look at the same national numbers, and we look at Trump's approval on the economy, he's at -17 on average on the economy. Remember, overall, he was at -12.7. So his evaluations of his handling of the economy are worse than evaluations of his job approval overall. Yeah. And when we look at our numbers here, we see 52% of Texans, so a majority disapproving of the job that he's doing on the economy. His approval is only 36%, so his disapproval is a little higher. His approval is a little bit lower. And the key here, again,
and just the economy thing, just one more, the other tab on that is that, among Republicans, he's still fine on the economy in Texas, but about 10 points lower than his overall.
Well, about 10 points lower than his overall at 73% approve overall. But the problem, here even, and I think this is a problem for elections, right? But that approval rating among Republicans, 73% approval in October on the economy.
Right.
Is tracks with where he's been. So first point, lack of erosion is key, right? So in August, he was at
to the extent that there's erosion, it's not really among Republicans.
Right. So 73% in October, 75% in August, 74% in June, 76% in April. So he's sitting in the same place on the economy that he's been throughout much of his presidency. The problem is, just for electoral politics, is if we go back to 2020 data, he was at 91% among Republicans. Right. There's an overwhelming approval of his handling of the economy. And so, you can say, well, that's not, 15 points is kind of a lot. And it's not as though, again, we've talked about this a lot, it's not as though, Republicans are going to abandon Trump and start, voting for, Gavin Newsom acolytes or whatever all over the place. But when you're talking about mobilizing people and he's not on the ballot and his, position is not as strong, even if it remains very strong.
And look, not to make this seem more complicated or insightful, it's a general question right now about whether Trump presidential voters in presidential years turn out in midterm years. Yeah. And there seems to be a lot of indication that they're less likely to do so.
Well, I think one of the things,
particularly, especially in some cohorts.
Right. And I think what, you and I were talking about a little bit before this is I think one of the difficulties in the last couple of weeks is that there's been an effort to sort of, we could talk about this. I'll frame it and then you react. I think there's been something of an effort to maybe overcomplicate or overinterpret some of the actions institutionally where we've seen some pushback from Republicans, and sort of this idea that, like, as you point out, the Fishers, the coalition, as he lost MAGA Republicans, oh my God, and if you read this stuff, there's just been a ton of this kind of coverage. Okay, interesting, sure.
Yeah.
But there's also part of it, which, we're talking about this morning, which is just like, yeah, maybe that's happening, but also like, he's not running again. He's in his second term. He's not a lame duck yet, but he's approaching that status at a certain point, which I'll let you get to.
Yeah.
And also, his numbers are deteriorating. And so, there's a certain just sort of assertion. I mean, we've kind of been dealing with a lot. How much of this is just normal politics and institutions asserting themselves in regular, in a regular way, and how much of this is, one of these, again, like everything else about Trump. And part of this is a very understandable media-driven, framing. Totally unique, first ever. We've never seen anything like this, right? And I think, part of it is I'm, at least in this moment right now, looking at all the data, and it's like, well, this kind of makes sense just in a basic, normal understanding of politics, at least to me. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that's the question, right? I mean, I think, you said we were talking about on the way in. I mean, it's been a challenge for 10 years now, so we ought to be used to it, right? Which is, to what extent do, the usual structural patterns prevail? To what extent, is Trump's position unique, immune, works differently in conjunction with those normal patterns? And now we just have the extra wrinkle of considering another couple of normal patterns that we haven't seen with him before, which is, presumably he can't run for re-election.
Right.
And, there is a kind of, lame, there's a looming lame duck pattern, right?
Yeah.
Which, I think, as you were saying, I mean, I think we're not quite ready to declare it that, but that's part and parcel of this question about is he losing the support of MAGA, whatever. And I do think that, on one hand, there's not much evidence of that.
Yeah.
But, I think you unpacked this well earlier when we were coming into the office. I mean, the Epstein thing is kind of it's a strange case, right?
Well, yeah.
I mean, if this turns out to be a kind of limit case of Donald Trump's power, well, what's the next one? I don't know. I mean,
and just real quick,
it is.
And I want you to jump back in. But part of this is like to say like, oh my God, the Congress faced with universal public opinion in both parties, all holding the same views about this, decides to stand up against the only person who seems to have a problem with it, who really is ready to just flip positions anyway once they kind of the cards are laid out. I mean, that's not like an amazing assertion of. No. I mean, I'll say first, I'll be honest, and I don't know the specifics of it, so I don't want to jump into it. I mean, I think if I was looking for something more interesting, I'm more interested in like Indiana not redistricting than I am in this vote. It's like a general, just to say that out loud. I mean, one thing that I think is interesting about this is one of the challenges maybe in analyzing this, and you were kind of pointing this out, is this idea that like, oh, he's losing, is he losing his grip over MAGA? And it's like, no, that's not the issue, because I think to your point about he's not a lame duck yet, because we still have Republican primaries, and his endorsement is still so important. And I wonder how much of the challenge here is a function of the fact that his power among the Republican base and among the the quote unquote MAGA Republicans is so strong. And the challenge is really the divergence between how strong his hold is on this group in the electorate and where his views are and where his hold is going with everybody else. Right. And that's when we talk about things like, we were talking real quick about the economy, and I was saying we focus on the Republican thing, but the fact is he's way underwater with independents. 61%, this is talking about Texas here, disapprove of his handling of the economy, 74% of inflation prices. Among Hispanics, it's 59 and 66%. Among suburban voters in Texas, which is where a lot of the competition is, it's 56 and 59% disapproval. Even in rural parts of the state, which is overwhelmingly Republican, on inflation and prices, 44-44.
Yeah.
And so it's like, on the one hand, as your point, this idea of like, well, how, every other sort of elite Republican politician has to address the fact that, his endorsement or his endorsement for somebody else is a big, big factor in the primaries that are coming up. But after that, which is also normal politics.
Yeah, and I think the point the point I was trying to make this morning we were talking about is that so I don't think we can really even begin to make a judgment about the state of Trump's overall position or his hold on the base until we see till after the primaries.
Yeah.
And because there's still too many elite incentives, and so, you look at like the things that are driving this discussion recently, the idea that, you've got, the Epstein thing, which is there and what it is. But there are these kind of other flashes of expressions of autonomy or, people sending up trial balloons. But the people and the issues that this is over are, not going to boil over, I think, until after the Republican primary. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to do what Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to do. But, I think people are right to focus on what her arguments have been, which is, she's really, she's leaning a lot into the foreign policy and the fact that, Trump just seems to not be delivering on, kind of this, these America first,
Right.
I mean, she's trying to rebrand. I mean, I saw some hashtag she was promoting, something like, making America great again and America first. Right?
Yeah.
And, silly in some ways, but telling that there is something going on there.
Well, I mean, and I don't want to I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking about this now, but
you were saying this is another one of those resumption of the normal pattern, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And this is all over the place. Not our take. It's a widely kind of, presidents tend to be more interested in foreign policy and legacy and things like that in a second term.
Right. And I think it's also not surprisingly someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a very enterprising politician, if you want to describe her any way at all, you could say that. But also, I've been having a lot of talks with people this week about divergences between sort of Ted Cruz's positions and the positions of the president. And I think in both cases, you look at people who, expect their political careers to go on beyond Donald Trump's term. And are looking at what the Republican Party is going to be in 2, 3, 4 years from this time. And in the case of someone like Cruz here in Texas, someone who I would say there's no indication that he ever stopped being interested in the presidency or doesn't want to be a leader in terms of what it means to be a conservative and, sort of a thought leader in the party. Yeah. And he's been, obviously cowed pretty aggressively over the period. I mean, I'll take that back. He's been cowed in certain ways. He's found other ways to honestly, really smartly expand his brand and his audience.
No,
and his
I
reach.
think in interesting ways he's been less cowed than a lot of others.
It's true.
He's been more, some people I think, and look, whatever, we can parse this probably to a point of non-productiveness.
Oh, I doubt.
But, I do think
I'm with
Cruz has been an interesting case in terms of when he's decided to align himself with Trump and how he has, I think, all along still been keeping an eye on maintaining his own brand and a certain amount of distinctiveness for
I think
himself.
That's totally fair. And I also I think it's not, it's not being too deferential to him or anything to note that I think Ted Cruz, believes a lot of what he says in a way that's really, I'm not saying that other people don't. I'm just saying it's a scale and it's a continuum and some people are more flexible on their positions than others. And I think Cruz, at least on a lot of issues, has, demonstrated himself pretty committed to his positions. And so,
look, he Weber, he practices politics as a vocation.
Yes.
He is attentive to the ethics of responsibility to all those former intern students out there from a few years ago.
Yeah.
Attentive to the political requirements and pragmatism, but does have some ideological ultimate ends, ethics of ultimate ends / North Stars that he probably keeps in mind more than a lot of others.
So at the end of the day, you're kind of like, so these politicians who have, career goals beyond the next 2 years are thinking about it. It's like, I think they are. Does it mean that the coalition is breaking apart at the seams? No. Not yet. Certainly.
Right.
And so I think that's
But there's a natural look, coalitions that are built, I guess is the way I would put this. There's a proposition.
Okay.
Coalitions that are built around presidential candidacies have a natural half-life.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think that's right.
And in the midst of them, we're almost, there's almost always a degree of myopia when we kind of say, the Obama coalition.
Right.
And then it fell apart, and then the Democrats were in trouble.
Yeah.
The MAGA coalition, and then it fell apart, and then the Republicans got it. We can go back.
Yeah.
Big, presidential candidate-driven party coalitions. Mm-hmm. And in presidential elections are always partially driven by that, and it's a big time to have Darren around. But, I mean, all things being equal, there is a natural half-life that is kind of structural.
Yeah.
And I would, this goes to, this kind of brings us back and connects with the Trump singularity problem.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, one could argue that, Trump, is an interesting case in which he does seem to have kept key parts of the coalition together, reconstituted it again under very favorable circumstances, between 2016 and 2023,
right,
2024. But even then, the coalition shifted.
Yeah.
With some local factors, I mean, the whole,
right,
question of Latinos and all that. But that's another
big part of it.
That's another big part of what's going on right now is that his Latino job approval numbers or his favorability numbers among Latino in our poll.
Yeah.
And we're seeing similar things in national polling. There was some of this in the Marist poll, in the Marist NPR poll, I think, that I saw sort of highlighted by somebody. That's not really very operative right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the floor has probably moved up, and that I think
Yeah, I think we talked about this.
The floor has
last week.
moved up, but I mean at this point it's not like but there's also kind of a clear ceiling, and it's getting a little bit.
And for those
lower.
in Texas, I mean the floor's not moved up very much.
No, I mean it's really almost
at least not in the favorability numbers as we see them.
No, it looks like a reassertion of where we were in some ways, 10 or 15 years ago. But the difference is that Hispanics are a bigger part of the electorate.
Yeah,
now.
we probably need to go and kind of unpack like some of just the self-identified party ID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and see what it looks like now.
Yeah, and you just kind of look at what that looks like in the data we have. So I guess where do we end up with this? I mean, there's something going on. I think it's still premature to kind of say, it's cracking up.
Yeah, well, I'll say that. I'll say this. We were talking again on the way in, and I think in the wake of the 2020 election, in the face of sort of a lot of really, a lot of disbelief in some cases among Republicans that Trump lost. And whatever that was based on, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to set that aside.
Although we know what it was based on.
Yeah, well, we know what a lot of it was based on. But, in facing that, part of what I kind of came away with is sort of point out, like, look, he was underwater on job approval. The economy was a real problem. People were very concerned about it. We were in the middle of a pandemic that people were very concerned about, that they felt like he wasn't taking seriously.
Right.
And whether his name is Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, anybody, that's a tough election to run in. It'd be very hard to win that election. And that's just basic politics because of just the fundamental things that we know about what matter. And part of it is like, as singular as Trump may be on a lot of things, and I think it's very fair to point that out, and as unprecedented as a lot of things may be, these factors still exist.
Yeah.
And they're still out there. And part of it is if you're looking at like, okay, so we've got a president in his second term focusing more on foreign policy and legacy building. We've got, some signs of some pushback, even if minimal within his coalition as we kind of get more towards the midterms, especially with, shaky economy and, some tough numbers. Again, it's one thing to say, do you want Trump's endorsement? Do you want him to come campaign with you for the general? That's the thing that we're kind of looking ahead to. And all that is, again, whether it was Donald Trump, whether it's Joe Biden, whether someone else, these are all kind of normal things. And in some ways, there's almost a reassertion of just some normal politics here in some sense, even if the first half of this year felt a little crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the, I hate to resort to the cliche, but I'm going to have to do it anyway, just because we don't have much time left and for me to sit here and think about something more
a better
creative.
cliche.
Well, it's just, I mean, I think one of the things that Donald Trump has benefited from, but is also the nature, I talked about myopia earlier, mm-hmm. the nature of being absorbed in the day-to-day of politics. Mm-hmm. Very, very easy to miss the forest for the trees,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there is something of that going on right now in which, look, on one hand, there's obviously some things going on. Now, the why that's going on, the extent of it, is going to be subject to a very familiar dynamic, which is that there's a primary environment and there's a general election environment.
Yep. Yeah, and one's coming up next.
Yeah, very close. And, just, fraught with uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because of the closeness of the partisan division in Congress and all this redistricting stuff going on.
Right. Yeah.
So, I think with that, we ought to leave it at that.
Yeah, let's leave it at
We'll
that.
leave it with the forest and the trees.
I think we solved that one. You're welcome, everybody.
Check. That's very fun. just a random observation. For some reason, I've just wanted to mention this. So I watched part of the, just because it came on after the news, the PBS American Revolution documentary.
Oh, I've heard mixed reviews, but I'm interested because I've been reading a lot about.
Yeah,
this era.
I know. That's why I was thinking that, and it's kind of, for me, it's like, I don't know much about like I just watched like episode 3 or something to start with 4 or whatever they broadcast last night. And it was a lot of the mid-level military maneuvering after the Revolutionary War started. And I just don't know much of that military history.
Yeah, I do.
And it was interesting to just, watch all that, but also to revisit all that. And thinking about the politics. I'm not even sure it really connects to any of this other than that, hey, it's out there, and it was kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal the Wall Street Journal editorial page had a thing about how it was, they didn't use the word, but it obviously connects to another thing going on in Texas right now that I don't want to give oxygen to. But, they didn't use it kind of woke or, they used a more Wall Street Journal editorial page.
Yeah, well.
A characterization of the narrative. But it, pretty interesting to look at the politics. Went back and watched a little of the first one, and again, I haven't watched that. I mean, I've read a lot recently about it, and it is, if you go back into that history, and I think our colleague Darren is really good about sort of reminding people that it's really easy to sort of have this view of the past as like like there was this. Well, back then everybody had a sense of purpose, right? And it's like, no, not at all. And it was like, it's basically you have this army kind of running away most of the time, and mostly lucky that basically the British kind of were not that interested who were there. Well, it was interesting to watch the middle episode and then go back and watch the beginning so you can see where the foreshadowing they're going to go. I mean, they talk about, Washington discovering very early in his career that, sometimes it was, you needed to just know when to retreat.
Oh, yeah, he learned that the hard way.
Yeah, well, but he even learned it, but the thing, how he learned it even as like a junior officer, right, in the French Indian War.
Yeah, in the French and Indian War. Yeah.
So anyway, kind of an interesting thing. And to your point about the messiness of it all.
Oh, so messy.
You forget the fight between the Loyalists and the Patriots was, pretty rough. A lot of people beating the crap out of each other in the street.
And that's the best thing that happened. And not only that, but I mean, there's fights. I mean, look, for the most part, if you were one of the states, you were not trying to send your militia to help this quote unquote national army. You're trying to protect your own stuff.
Yeah.
So, there was fighting going on.
Shit about those guys in Pennsylvania.
No, I mean, there was so much fighting going on internally. While, this sort of malaria, this sort of plagued army was just sort of bloodily marching along trying to avoid the British, and really just by the skin of their teeth, we're lucky that the British commanders were like slightly less interested.
Yeah, and made some
real strategic errors.
Kind of made some errors.
Yeah,
So anyway, check it out.
Yeah, I'm down.
With that, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin, as always. Thanks to Josh for being here. We didn't talk about a ton of data here, but as always, data, lots of other treats, downloadable graphics for your, teaching. If you're
maybe Thanksgiving,
if you're teaching, it's getting to the end of the semester. Download some graphics, drop them in your slides. Very easy.
Maybe you're going to see family over the holidays, and you'd like to spur a discussion.
Yeah, you could give people. Yeah, you could give people a gift. Make them some calendars using Texas Politics Project graphics. Cool. So anyway, all the results we talked about and other interesting things at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. I believe we will be taking next week off for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I think we will too.
But then we'll be back after that with another second reading podcast. So have a good holiday. If you're traveling, travel safe. If you're in Central Texas, look out for the rain. As always, I can't tell exactly how bad. I think it's going to be worse in some places than others. But
that's really brilliant analysis.
Turn around, don't drown. How's that?
There we go.
So thanks for listening. Signing out. Finally. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.